welcome to the How Do I Become podcast. I'm your host, Chris Gouveia. In this episode, we'll be exploring how do I become a startup founder. As always, thanks for listening. All right, well, welcome to the podcast, Doug Ludlow, CEO and founder of Mainstreet. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, happy to be here.
So tell me a little bit about what Mainstreet does. Maybe tell us what an elevator pitch is, since we're going to be talking about startup founding. Tell us what an elevator pitch is, and then give me your elevator pitch for Mainstreet.
So an elevator pitch is, the term comes up in that you want to be able to pitch an investor in the time it takes to ride in one elevator ride with them. So it's like 15 to 30 seconds. It's maybe 2 to 3 sentences to pique their interest, and it's not where you sell them.
And what is yours for Mainstreet?
So Mainstreet helps connect startups, founders, and small business owners with the $300 billion industry that is government credits and incentives. We make it incredibly easy for entrepreneurs to receive tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars per year in savings they didn't even know they were missing. And that's basically it. It's it's a pretty clear, like, you're going to save money, and it's an enormous market. If we can convey those two things in 2 to 3 sentences, we've done our job.
Great. Well, I'm intrigued. I want to hear more. So tell me where you are in the navigation of a startup and kind of what things are like for you.
Oh, sure. So I can give a little context here. So the founders of Mainstreet, the three of us, myself, Dan Lindquist, and Daniel Griffin, were all on the small business team at Google in a variety of ways. I was the chief of staff for the group. Dan was a PM, and Daniel was, and of course it still is, an engineer. And we decided we wanted to leave Google to start a very mission-driven company. The idea is we want to start a company that helps small businesses and startup founders get the help and resources they needed to help create jobs and opportunity. Mm-hmm. So we jumped off from Google last year, and we went through a lot of different product ideas and product visions. Our mission has remained the same, but the product has changed quite a bit. And we went through times to where nothing we were doing was working, or mm-hmm. or moments where there was some interesting things that were going well. But it took a little while to dial into what where we are now. I'm happy to dive into that a little bit further. But where we are now is we've hit something that they'll call in the startup world product market fit, to where we've demonstrated that what we're offering is actually something that the market's willing to pay for, and the market's willing to absorb and buy, which is a great feeling to have. Many startups don't get to this phase. It's wandering in the wilderness for a long time. So where we are, we hit product market fit, and we're in a pretty intense period of refining the product and getting it ready for true scale.
Okay.
So building the support infrastructure. So it's a very busy time to be at, but it's really kind of a pretty gratifying time to realize, like, okay, we're on the right path in here at the right technology, to really then kind of throw a lot of fuel on the fire for next year and take us to a much larger place.
So that's exciting. Sounds like a lot of rapid growth now. So tell me about the day-to-day for yourself and your company.
So there's a huge transition when we went from in-person to remote. And it's been a bit of a discovery process, trying to figure out how do we make this work, right? For the rest of almost the entire team, it's the first time we've been in an entirely remote company. And what we've tried to do is really lean into almost over communicating, right? So we start the day generally with a entire team stand up, and this is just a quick 10-minute check-in, just to ensure that, hey, everyone gets to see each other's face. If there's a big interesting update for the company, we share it there. We usually try to do some sort of fun team building activity every morning, even if it's just a quick, like, hey, what do you prefer, chocolate or vanilla ice cream? And everyone answers, silly things like that, just to build some level of team rapport and team morale. And we'll then break it into individual team meetings, where the sales team will meet with the sales team, the eng team will meet together, etc. And then really it's the rest of the day for me personally is very scheduled. My entire day almost runs in 30-minute blocks, where most of that is spent on Zoom, right? And this actually is my schedule is far more akin to what it used to be like when I was at Google than in previous startups. Only because here, if you're going to have a conversation with someone, it has to be pre-scheduled.
Right.
So that's been interesting. So again, there's a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of Slack conversations. Uh, we try to make sure I have a one-on-one with everyone in the team at least once a week. Usually, my co-founders I'm talking to pretty regularly. And of course, I'm working at home, and my kids are here, so part of my day is spent, helping to make them lunch at times, helping with homework, helping them print stuff. So it's an interesting blend of pretty much always on work as well as like the family stuff that you know I- it it's a nice break from work. It's also an interesting distraction in a variety of good and bad ways.
Tell me a little bit about lifestyle in terms of, I think people get an idea of a startup being kind of morning and night, 24 hours a day. The CEO, the founders are thinking about it. Are you having to live that lifestyle? Or are you able to strike a balance for that?
So I go in waves, right? I think certainly right now, to be perfectly candid, it is 24/7. I'm always thinking about this. I suppose that's a good thing. I think we're in a position now, as I mentioned, we hit a level of product market fit. We've raised some money and we're really sprinting as fast as we can, uh, which is a great position to be in, right? I think there's definitely something to be said for work life balance. There really is. Uh, but I think right now I'm kind of okay with the fact that like my life is not balanced at all, right? It's my office is like, I can if I open the door as looking of the room I'm sitting in, I'd see my kitchen, right? And I think my daughter and her friend are in there baking a cake, right?
Hmm.
So it is this weird merger of personal life and professional life. And there's no way I could sustain this for the rest of my career.
Sure.
There really isn't, right? This level of intensity of work, uh, with being at home, I might work remotely for the rest of my career, but this level of intensity, I don't think I could keep up. But for the time being, while the company is going through hyper growth, and while uh, it's a requirement of me to do this, I think I'm fine with that.
Tell me about the cons of that. So the pros so far, we're hearing a lot. You're striking a good work-life balance. Your company is growing. Um, Tell me about the cons of being in a startup, because you've done some other startup companies where you're doing those sprints and maybe that didn't work out. So tell me about the dark side of a startup founder.
So one of the interesting things that happened to me in previous startups, and I see this with every founder, is you end up your personality becomes your self-worth comes from your startup. Your identity
Mm.
comes from your
Hmm.
startup, right? To where when it's going good, you're on cloud, a million. When it's going poorly, you're in the depths. And when you succeed, you think you're a genius, and when you fail, you couldn't be lower. And for me personally, this is the interesting thing I think about this startup, and maybe it's just some experience. Although the work on this is intense, I think I've actually managed to separate out in a very healthy way. That recognizing that like my startup is not my identity. It's not who I am. Who I am is my family and my children and my wife and and my friends, and that is unrelated to, it is disconnected from the success or the failure of the startup, especially on the day to day. And so that is really the world. The emotional toll that can take on a startup founder can be great when you don't separate those things out. There's also, I think, on a smaller level, there's a great analogy I heard, and I forget who said this. I think it was one of the former executives at Intel years ago, and that running a startup like this or being in any position like this, your balance is like a juggling act, right? And while that's cliche, some of the balls you're juggling are rubber balls, and some of them are glass balls,
Mm.
right? The rubber balls are things you can drop and they're not going to break. Uh, maybe that's your bowling league. Maybe that's I don't know. Maybe that's going out to see movies. Maybe that is the ability to relax. The glass balls, on the other hand, are your family and your relationship with your spouse and your children. It's your health to a certain degree, right? And so you really, I guess my experience of being now this is my third startup, recognizing that so long as I'm taking care of these glass balls, it's okay if the others drop because I can
Hmm.
always pick them up later. And that is a lesson that's been hard learned.
Yeah, that's I think, a very astute lesson that you're giving. Can you take me back to the very beginning? What got you interested in startups, and then what's been your experience through them?
So if I trace back my earliest interest in startups, like back in Modesto, California, I started a little lawn mowing business,
Hmm.
in my neighborhood. I'd charge $5 to mow the lawn. I and I think I've always been interested in being an entrepreneur, like always, always coming with ideas. most of them terrible, but some of them, not half bad. But I guess my real professional career as a startup started actually maybe a year or so after I graduated college. I was working at the time. My first job out of UCLA was I was a speechwriter for the then Lieutenant Governor of California, Cruz Bustamante. And this was during a time when there was massive I mean, just like today, there's protests, but there was massive movements and protests about immigration. And I was living in the middle of downtown LA, uh, and that's where my office was based as well. And these giant, hundreds of thousands of people
Mm.
protests at the time were being organized by text message and MySpace. And I thought, gosh, there has to be a better way to do this. How do we? Can you provide a technological tool that would help coordinate mass communication like this? And so I actually left my job as a speechwriter and started a little company. And it was actually a very similar product to what Twitter became. We call it Zemble as a Assemble. It was a terrible business name, and we didn't know what we were doing. But that was the first time I ever got into the world of technology startups and fundraising. And from that, I stayed in it for really the rest of my career, bouncing between whether it's a startup that I founded and whether it was a success or failure, working for other startups, or working at a big company like AOL or most recently Google.
I think your comment hits on a couple of things. One is that the startup world, as we know it, is really geared towards the huge companies. But startups can really mean anything. Having a product idea that you think can be successful, and then scaling it up from there, or just growing that organically. I think that's really interesting. Also, you mentioned that you had gone to undergraduate. Was your undergraduate in anything related to what you're now doing in the startup world?
Not at all. It was history and political
Right,
science.
right. Can you tell me a little bit more about what other companies you've been involved with and what the lessons you've learned from them?
Sure. Would you prefer to hear about the startup world or the big company world?
Tell me about startup world.
I think if I had to take away the easy one for the startups I've run myself, my third company here, uh, there's a phrase I use a lot, and I share this with employees that join the company. It's that I really want people to avoid the illusion of progress. And by that, I mean, it's really easy to spend a lot of time and focus on things that actually don't matter at all, but feel really good, right? A
Mm,
perfect example of that would be, you know, finding a new office and decorating that office, right? Some companies and some founders spend literally weeks, if not months, obsessing over this. And because it really feels it's very tangible and it's fun. And it's fun to see your
sure.
name up on the wall. But in the end, that didn't sign you a single additional customer. It didn't make your product better. And so you spent a ton of time on it and it felt like it was progress, but it was just an illusion. And that same thing happened over and over and over again. Like, I remember, my first company, how excited it was. We spent a ton of time to figure out the HR system. And we now had insurance for everyone.
Mm,
And that was great. It's good to have insurance, but maybe we could have found a simpler solution and found someone to do it for us rather than us figure it out ourselves
sure.
because that actually didn't move the company forward. So I guess the biggest lesson I'd say on that you know, is you really have to keep finding that one thing that actually works and trying to push aside all the things that are distractions or pushing past the things that don't really work. And that's the only way you're going to be successful in a startup.
And it's a great lesson. If you had one pearl or tip to give someone that's trying to do a startup or trying to create a company, would that be it, or do you have something else you would tell them?
I mean, avoiding the illusion of progress is a really good one. I would actually encourage someone who's thinking about doing a startup to really stop and say, is this something that you really
Mm,
want to do? And by then, everyone wants to start. Like, is this something that should be a full time project, or is it something that could be kind of a side hustle? Right? A lot of people when they're bored with their job, a lot of people when they want to try something new, it's like, all right, let me start a startup, let me start a new company here. And you really have to ask yourself, like, is this something that needs to be a standalone startup, or is this something that could be a little
mm,
project? Is this a hobby I want to develop? And so, and the reason I say that is depending on which direction you go, there are a lot of choices and compromises and hard decisions you have to make when you're building that company. If it's a small business that is not like a venture funded company, you may have to take on debt. You may have
mhm,
to loan money yourself. You may have to bootstrap for years, and that's very difficult. If
right.
it's a venture funded company, you're going to have to bring in outside investors, and that is not always an easy process. So, I guess my advice would be, even before you jumped off, make sure this is something that you must do,
Mm,
right? Make sure it's something that you're compelled to do, or and that something like, by the way, that you're pretty sure there's a real financial market.
Right.
And a lot of people jump into things like they have this idea, but don't even think past to the point of like, is this actually a marketable business? So yeah, the tidbit is like, it takes years of your life, literally. It's incredibly hard. You'll make more money working for someone else. So you got to ask yourself, do you really want to do this? And if you do, then take the next step. But like a lot of people are really surprised when they actually ask themselves, is this what I want to spend the next 10 years of my life on?
Sure.
Is this what I want to risk? A big company job salary? Uh, and a lot of times their honest answer is no. And I think that's the best thing. You're given limited time in life. And so you don't want to waste that time on something you don't actually really want to do. And for some people, that's a startup. For some people, that's a big company. Uh, it really is a choice of like, don't start this journey unless it's something you must do.
Great. So maybe that gives insight to your decision making, because I know you mentioned you were at Google before this, which is, I think, would fit that role of a corporate job that has good salary, good lifestyle, regular hours, and now you've made this plunge back into the startup world. Can you give us some insight into your decision making and when you made that decision?
Sure. So I when I joined Google, the term was acqui-hired into Google, right? This was a startup that wasn't necessarily successful, but they helped bring some of the members of the startup in to help build a new product. I originally thought I'd only spend a year at Google, like vest some stock and hop out. I ended up really enjoying it. I spent 3.5 years there, and it was a side of the business world that I didn't ever see. I assumed like I was going to be smarter and faster than
Mm,
most people there, and just kind of biding my time. And no, I was really challenged and met a lot of really smart, capable people. And I found I started learning a ton, uh, and which was great. Like it was definitely patched. I became a much better manager. When you're at a startup, you're moving so fast, you don't really have time to learn new skills. You really don't,
mm,
right? And like you'll learn how to do some things, but how do you manage a large team? How do you do performance reviews? How do you structure a budget? These are things that like you don't you learn trial by fire.
sure.
So I spent longer at Google than I thought I would. I think I decided to leave for a variety of reasons. Uh, one of which was, I'll give three real reasons, right? One, it's just what I like doing, right? I mentioned I've been an entrepreneur one way or another since I was 7, 8 years old. Uh, it's really a lot of fun. It's an addictive thing. Once you do it, you'll understand like, wow, this is really great. Uh, the second part was a bit of a financial decision, and this is something that like I actually have a strong feeling about this. If you're going to live in the Bay Area, which I do, I live in San Jose. Uh, so you're living in this weird world that looks like a suburb, but is really like the price of Midtown Manhattan, right?
Right.
And if you're going to live here, I actually don't think it makes sense to just do a normal corporate job. Even that corporate job pays well. It would make far more sense to move to, let's say, Denver or Salt Lake or a much more affordable area that still has these
Mm,
great tech jobs, right? The Bay Area is the best for the huge outsized exits. And this is where you go big or go home. So part of it, like we want to stay in the Bay Area. And I thought rationally, actually financially, that was that was the rational choice to make. And finally, we actually believed in this mission that we wanted to start. This mission was founded actually, or this company was founded partially because of the what I observed in my hometown, our hometown, growing up. You look at a place like Modesto and many other places in the country, and you realize that there's just not the resources, the infrastructure, the support to build jobs, and that's a problem we want to actually help
mm,
solve, right? I do care. There's this massive inequality that's been growing between wealthy areas like San Francisco, New York, Seattle, etc., and much of the rest of the country. I wanted to help solve that problem, and that's kind of the main reason I actually did this. And part of it was financial, part of it is because it's really fun, and part of it's because like I knew at Google, as much as I was learning, as much as I enjoyed the people, and I really did, that I would have an impact on a pretty small corner of the world. Like I'll optimize an ad, I'll help some people here and there.
mhm.
But if I really wanted to help, change the world in a not ironic way, but actually legitimately help people, I'd have to jump off and start on my own. So uh, that's why I left Google.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the steps of a startup that you went through?
That's a great question. So it all goes up in very distinct stages, and you have this period at the very beginning where you have no money, and at that point anyone who's joining the team is a founder, right? So that is where you earn your outsized equity. That's where you go from being someone who owns, you know, a double digit equity in the company, if not, if you're a solo founder, 100%. And the reason being, you're trading in, your salary for the ability to do this. And so there, anyone that joins the company at that stage is basically a partner with you. They're there to help build, and you're really just trying to find something that works, some glimmer of, what are we doing here. The next level, raising a friends and family. Not everyone has access to a large network. In fact, most people don't.
Right.
I And so, fortunately, because not everyone has wealthy friends and family, I certainly didn't when I started this. More and more support is being given by excuse me, accelerators, right? Like Y Combinator or Techstars, to where if you have a good idea and you're just getting started and have a good team, they'll be able to fund you a little bit more. So there's that. All right, we're starting to make this a little more serious. We have funds to hire other people. There are many accelerators. Techstars and Y Combinator are probably the two most famous and well known, but there are literally hundreds across the country that can connect you with capital and talent. And that's a great place to start kind of formalizing, hey, this is a real business. We're starting to get additional talent. Anyone you recruit at this level isn't going to get the founder equity, but they're still going to get a very outsized amount. Right now, you're talking single digit equity for these people. To scale to the next level beyond that, you need to have an idea that has demonstrated some level of traction. And this would be, you start talking about a seed round, right? If you heard of seed financing, and this could be anywhere from $500,000 up to like $10 million of funding. Most seed companies can expect to raise anywhere from quarter million to $1 to $2 million. Usually, it's somewhere between like a $4 to $10 million valuation. And this is very specific for tech startups. You can expect it, like in the valley, you can expect to give away anywhere from 20 to 30% of your company at each round, including the seed round. And
Mhm.
the whole point of the seed round is to take this idea with a little bit of traction and find that elusive product market fit that we were talking about. Like, demonstrate that, like, hey,
Mhm.
what we built, people actually want to buy. I think it's Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, talks about your goal is to find something that people want. It doesn't matter if it's just 100 people. If you can find something that someone will pay for, that someone will use, and that's your goal at seed. As you go beyond that, once you found that elusive product market fit, then the journey becomes actually a little more straightforward for the most part. You start taking on a finance, if we, Series A, which can be anywhere from $5 to $20 million. You take on a Series B, which can be 10 to in some cases 100 million. But that really, the whole point of that additional funding, which starts to get into these numbers that sound absurdly large, uh, is to scale what you've built during that seed phase. And that's why there are tens of thousands of seed companies all desperately trying. And at each step of the way, there's orders of magnitude less companies at each step. Uh, but those companies that make it through that phase, you've been able to demonstrate that growth. And at each step, it actually becomes easier to start hiring talented people because you have more money in the bank.
Sure.
And yet, the people who join, their equity will be worth fractions of what the very first founders and first employees in the company will have. So it is that trade off. Like, if I always encourage people who want to experience the startup world without being a founder, is go jump in at the Series B level,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because at that point, maybe late A, maybe Series B. At that point, you've raised enough money that it will be a far more stable job for the most part. It'll still be fun. You'll still have an ability to learn a lot, but a lot of the risk has gone down, right? Let's say if in acquisition IPO, maybe you'll make a few $100,000, which is not a bad deal at all, but you'll also be paid well along the way. And that's a really good way to, you know, experience the highs of a startup without having to risk everything at the seed and Series A level.
That's super helpful. Any other topics you want to make sure you hit on, Doug, or anything specific about the company you want to touch on? I think it's been a great summary of what your company does. The reasons you've moved back and forth. I think also some really, really helpful tips for people that hopefully will listen and maybe might not start up their own startup, but at least kind of hear these ideas of like, oh, if I did start up something, these are worthwhile information to hear.
Yeah, I think there's maybe some of the one last piece I'd share about the startup world is it is I hate to say this, but the startup world likes to pretend that it is a meritocracy in one in which, hey, just work hard and you have a good idea. And that's not always the way it is, actually. I have been very surprised during my decade plus in the startup world how it is very much about who knows who
Sure.
and how you like who do you trust and who can you bank on. And so I'd encourage anyone who's interested in the startup world that starting to meet people, and this that's actually the most important part, right? And you could do you don't have to be crazy investors. You can go to meetups, and now virtual meetups. You can work on side projects. You can go to startup weekends. I have been shocked at, like, for example, what just to talk about how it is this world. I met from my very 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 first company. We pitched it at a few different Silicon Valley meetups. We drove up from LA, pitched it, and one of the guys there who was also pitching next to me, whose name was Saul Lippman. He was running a company called I think Sticky Cam. It was an early like USB cool memory thing. We often became friends and kept in touch. Well, later, multiple companies later, I was running a company called Hipster. He had a company that had been acquired by AOL, and Saul was the person who basically led the acquisition of my company Hipster at AOL. And at the time, I was not running a company that was successful. Saul was running a much smaller company, but that relationship we developed, Saul was in a position to really, make a somewhat life-changing move for me. And it's because I started meeting people and networking and opening myself to those opportunities. So it's my long-winded way of saying, like, in the end, the best product usually wins, and numbers don't lie. But you should start developing those human relationships as soon as you can, even if you're just interested in this world, because in the end, we're still all people, and you invest in the people you trust. And if you could have decades or years worth of trust with someone, or months worth of trust, they're going to invest in you, or invest in your idea, or join your team at a far greater rate than someone you're just meeting cold. So just remember, it's still about people. It's still about politics and getting to know people, and it's not as much of a meritocracy as we like to make it claim. It's very much a who knows who, but there's ways to get into it.
Where would someone go to get that type of information or hear about the meetups? What are some specific sites?
I'd start reading TechCrunch. I'd start reading Recode.
Mm-hmm.
I'd start, going on Hacker News, like just some of these news sources that will often talk about, hey, here's this, a TechCrunch fintech meetup in, back when we could meet up in person,
Mm-hmm.
in Santa Monica. Here's a thing Recode is sponsoring a get together in New York, right? And so that's just the easiest way to jump in. You could look up you go to startupweekend.com or maybe .org. Startup Weekend hosts these events where you can come together and not know anyone, pair off into teams, and you have to launch a product over the course of a weekend, right? It's a great way to start networking with people and get to know them.
Yeah, and a great way to learn the language, because I think, we've gone over some of the jargon that's within this industry. And as someone that's in medicine, this is all new to me. So that's great to hear another way for people to get that experience.
No, and the crazy thing is, like, I'm trying to keep this actually somewhat high level because I recognize not everyone knows these terms. As silly as it sounds, the HBO show Silicon Valley is actually worth a watch.
Sure.
It is closer to reality than most people realize. Like, the same issues they're facing in a funny way are actually the same issues faced by real startup founders. So as much as it sounds like a joke, if you're interested in the startup world, watch HBO's Silicon Valley. If you don't mind language, because there's a lot of it. But it gives you a real sense of like what the life is like in a hyper stylized way.
All right. Well, Doug, that was super fun, super helpful. Thanks again for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right, that does it for today's episode of the How Do I Become podcast. Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed what you listened to, please subscribe and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You can also follow us on social media, Twitter and Instagram at How Do I Become One with the number 1. All of our videos are also posted to YouTube under the channel name How Do I Become. Thanks again.